Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, the author of Lenape Country, Gene Soderlund.
Gene Soderlund, author of Lenape Country, Delaware Valley Society before William Penn. What got you interested in this subject?
Well, it was a process for me because the field of colonial American history has changed a great deal since the 1980s. Prior to then, the Native Americans simply weren't part of the story or in any positive way. And then several historians indicated that we were missing a great deal. And my own background, my dissertation, was on the Quakers and slavery. And I had worked on the papers of William Penn. So I was very much involved in the mainstream history, if you will, by that time, by the 1980s. But was very much aware also of the ongoing trend, in our field. And so more and more books were coming out, including those focusing on Pennsylvania. And that's where it ended, that the story started with William Penn and his plans and hopes for the colony. And then when the authors integrated or focused on the interaction between Pennsylvanians and Native Americans, they started there. And Penn was given the credit, for bringing peace, ideas of peace and freedom, and trying to establish good relations with Lenapes and other Native Americans who lived in the area. So the story started there. And I grew up in New Jersey, and I had learned about Lenapes in New Jersey, and Lenapes who were still there after the 7 Years' War, whereas the mainstream narrative of the middle colonies was that the Lenapes, and as they were called in the 18th century by the British, the Delawares, moved west. And really, there were no Native Americans left in the middle colonies after the 7 Years' War. So I needed to come to grips with this difference. Colonial historians saying that there were no Indians left in the middle colonies after the 7 Years' War, or even earlier after the Walking Purchase, and the fact that I knew that there were Native Americans still in New Jersey from other reading. So I decided to write a book on the New Jersey Delawares. And I even had a contract with the University of Pennsylvania Press for a book along those lines, the Jersey Indians. So I wrote a couple of articles for books, book chapters basically, on the Jersey Indians in the 18th century. And what I found going forward from that was that the history was much more complex. If you start with the Dutch, when they enter the Delaware Valley in about, 1615. And so what I decided at that point was to change the focus. And I learned as I read the documents. I didn't start out thinking that I was going to write a book that was going to challenge the understandings we had about Native Pennsylvania, New Jersey colonists relations. And I think that's where the documents took me.
What did you learn?
Well, I learned that 3 myths that we have held are simply myths. They're not fact. One myth is that William Penn brought the ideals, the principles of peace and freedom, good relations with Native Americans, to the Delaware Valley. And that's not true. Really, an important part of my thesis is that these principles were here with the Lenapes. And what they did over the time frame from about 1630 to 1631 to when Penn receives his charter for Pennsylvania in 1681 is to establish a close relationship with some of the Europeans who settled in the Delaware Valley. And that these principles started with the Lenapes because they were very much interested in freedom. That was like the foundation of their belief system. And they believed, unlike other Native Americans, that the way to keep one's freedom is by not going to war and not being a warlike people. And so they saw the connection between peace and freedom.
I'm going to read what you wrote. You say the Lenape identified themselves as a free people subject to no one, and as a group that had no interest in destroying the liberty of others. They believed that peace and freedom, like war and slavery, went hand in hand.
Right.
So the idea of tolerance and getting along with others came from the Lenape and not from William Penn?
Yes. Well, I don't think we can be quite as simple as that, because the Quakers, William Penn certainly brought these principles with them. But it was a process that was ongoing. That is a process of developing a culture that started with the Lenapes, grew with the Swedes and the Finns and Dutch and others who settled in the Delaware Valley, incorporated people of all different backgrounds, and opposed heavy-handed authority. So my point there is that it's not simply a matter of static beliefs or principles, but this culture that developed in the Delaware Valley, a culture that has ideals. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we always live up to these ideals. We certainly don't. There's certainly been enough hatred and imposing one's authority on others in the Delaware Valley. But these principles are there. And it was a process in which the Europeans and the Native Americans worked out a culture that they were able to transmit through actions that they took, through statements, through ways of working together, so that they did have an impact on what we consider to be a culture, a Delaware Valley culture.
Are there documents you can find that tell this story from the Lenape perspective?
Well, that's very difficult. I mean, there are basically 3 different sources for historians seeking to tell a story like this. One is archaeology, and through that you can learn something about the changing cultures of the Lenapes, for millennia. And then you can also learn something about the interactions between Europeans and Native Americans through archaeology as well, because you can find European objects as well, and where they are and in what quantity is useful. Then you have documents created by Europeans, and I used more of that as evidence than anything else. The third, before I forget to say third, is oral culture. And I did interview a number of people who have Lenape background for the book, but that was a rather minor part of my source list, because I wanted to try to stay within the time frame and try to use sources as much as I could from the time period, moving from the early 17th century into the 18th century. So the challenge that historians have is trying to figure out what the Lenapes were thinking and doing from European documents. And so we say that we're interpreting across the line. That is, we're trying to get to the truth, or to the extent you can say anything, is true, trying to gather as much about the Lenapes' thinking and actions from these European documents. And I was thinking this morning in thinking about what we would be talking about, and we do the same for Europeans as well. And I did quite a bit of that here. I mean, historians generally have worked with documents created by Europeans, but have thought about, okay, what are their true motives? What were they really, what did they really believe? Because you have to say, okay, who are they producing this document for? And in the case of the Swedish governors, they were sending reports back to Sweden about what they were doing, what was happening, and they wanted to put the best face they could on what they were doing and what was happening. And so you had to look at what else was going on. What were other documents indicating at the same time, and put what was happening in the Delaware Valley into the larger context. So there are a number of examples that I could give if you want to talk about.
Sure.
Well, one example of how it works for both the Europeans and the Lenapes is what Francis Jennings, the historian, who just was wonderful in terms of his work, called the deed game, where Europeans would seek to get as much property as they could from the Native Americans in order to show their superiors back in Europe, how successful they were. So when the Swedes came, they went up and down the Delaware River, talking with various Lenape groups and writing deeds for the property they wanted, and then getting the Lenape leaders, the sachems, to sign. And so in the case of the area around Wilmington, okay, and north to the falls where Trenton is today, and south as well to Cape Henlopen, and then on the other side of the river, they would have these deeds, the natives signed, the Swedish governors sent back these deeds to Sweden and said, okay, we own the Delaware River. Well, as far as the Lenapes were concerned, they owned a patch of land, okay, enough to raise crops to support a trading post, because the Lenapes were most interested in trade.
Did Sweden, first of all, what was going on in Sweden back then? This is 1630s?
Right, 1638.
Why would they have been sending people to the New World?
Well, they saw themselves as part of the European system.
So they wanted colonies in the New World?
They did, and they had several colonies elsewhere in the Atlantic area, but this was their only colony in North America, and it lasted only from 1638 to 1655, when the Dutch took over. But the Lenapes were still in charge. Even though we think in terms of European conquest, they weren't conquering the Delaware Valley.
How many Swedes were there at the time relative to the number of Lenape who were in the area?
Yeah. New Sweden was very small. It at its largest population, when it was still New Sweden, it had 400 inhabitants. For most of the time, it had about 200 inhabitants.
You use the phrase Swedish nation in the book. Did they consider themselves a nation?
Well, nation had different meaning at the time. And we would think of it as a town, basically, or maybe a county at this point, where this group had integrity as a people, but they had a small government. And at the point where it's called the Swedish nation is after the Dutch take over. And the Dutch start calling them the Swedish nation. And it was interesting. And it also shows the collaboration between the Lenapes and the Swedes and Finns, because a year after, in 1656, a year after the Dutch took over the colony, a ship came from Sweden with 100 passengers who were mostly Finns. And it's the Mercurius affair that I'm going to talk about. But what happens is that they have lots of trade goods, which were of interest to the Lenapes in the fur trade. And then it had Finns who were very much like the Lenapes in some ways. So the ship comes into the Delaware, stops at one of the forts, and the Dutch commander of the fort is very much concerned and contacts Peter Stuyvesant, who's the governor of New Sweden, and says, okay, what do we do? Do we let them land, or do we send them back to Sweden? And Peter Stuyvesant has no question about it. He says, send them back. They can come here to Manhattan and bring on supplies, but under no circumstances can we let them stay here, because they would augment the allies of the Lenapes, and they would also be competing with the Dutch with those trade goods. He didn't want more Swedes and Finns in the Delaware Valley. And so the ship got ready to leave, and when the Lenapes became aware of their departure, they went on board with some Swedes and Finns as well. But the Lenapes made it clear, you're not going back to Sweden, you're staying here. Otherwise, we will attack both you, the Swedes and Finns, and the Dutch. They're ready, they're threatening this.
Why did they want them there?
Well, the previous year, with the contest over New Sweden, with the conquest, actually even a year before that, the Lenapes and the Swedes and Finns had become closer. We have to remember that the Lenape population was declining from smallpox and other diseases. So whereas they had probably been about 8,000 people in 1600, they were more like 4,000 people during this time period. So they were looking for allies, the Lenapes, and they were very much interested in making peace. They promised to let the Swedes and Finns know if they heard that they were going to be attacked. And in fact, they warned the Swedes that Stuyvesant was going to attack New Sweden in 1655, but the Swedes couldn't do anything about it in any case.
Why did the Dutch want to take over New Sweden?
To control the trade. The trade was important because it wasn't simply local, but rather the Susquehannocks, who lived along the Susquehanna River near here, had contacts with the natives in Canada. And they had established a very lucrative trade with the Hurons and other people of northern, not northern, but of Canada, and even central Canada, which was where the best furs were, because the winters are cold, and it's a colder climate. And so the beaver trade was very important. And so earlier, the Susquehannocks had established an outlet on the Delaware River. So the Lenapes and the Susquehannocks both were very active, looking for trade, and so the Dutch wanted to control that trade.
Back in Europe, were Sweden and the Netherlands at war around then?
No,
It was not part of a larger European war?
no. In fact, they were quite close in terms. The first group of colonists who came to New Sweden were largely Dutch. I mean, at least a third of the men who came, there were 24 men who came, and at least a third of them were Dutch. The first governor, Peter Minuit of New Sweden, was Dutch. The Dutch had established colonies. They were in New Netherland, for example, and other places around the world. So they had the know-how, and so the Swedish company took advantage of that know-how.
What was the Swanendael massacre?
That is very interesting because the stereotype of the Lenapes in popular culture is that they were very peace-loving. And there are many stories about why the Lenapes attacked that colony, which was near Cape Henlopen, where Lewis, Delaware is now. And the Dutch sent a group of about 30 men to establish this colony that would not only be a trading post, but also be the start of plantation agriculture in the Delaware Valley. And they bought the land, they bought a large strip of land, they said, from the Sikonesinks, who were the Lenapes who lived in the area. And so this group was sent. The first thing that they did after building their house and starting to grow crops, tobacco and corn, was to send to send a ship across the bay to buy another plantation where Cape May, stands or is. And so when they came back, the Sikonesinks were very much concerned because the Dutch didn't have enough trade goods left after they had crossed. And so the Sikonesinks started to wonder exactly how this plantation was going to develop. According to what we can know about what the Sikonesinks thought, they thought they sold enough land for a trading fort and a farm to help support it. When they saw these men working in the fields, and they became concerned. And then the Dutch set up a sign, the sign of the Netherlands, establishing ownership over a broad swath of land. One of the sachems took down the sign and made pipes out of the tin. And the Dutch became very upset about it. And so they said to some of the Sikonesinks in the area, bring in the culprit who did this. We want to talk to him about it. The Sikonesinks thought that this was a major offense in the eyes of the Dutch. And some of them went out and killed the man who cut up the sign. When the Dutch heard that, they took in his head. And when the Dutch talked to them, they said, this isn't what we expected. We just wanted to talk to him, and say, don't do it again, Now, that was the story that was given to the Dutch captain, David de Vries, by a Sikonesink when he came. And, that makes sense. But the reaction was too broad for simply a situation where a man was killed, by misunderstanding. Normally, the Lenapes, the Sikonesinks, would have required the Dutch to give compensation to cover the death of the man. And in fact, they had actually killed him. So it wasn't as if the Dutch had. But I think they interpreted the situation such that they saw the Dutch as being of offending, and so they saw them as the murderers of this man. So the Swanendaels went back, talked to the family of the man who killed, and they came back and killed all of the inhabitants of the plantation. That's much too much of a reaction. The Lenapes conducted mourning war, but that was only when the offender didn't compensate by covering the death. So there were other explanations that historians have given. One has suggested that the animals, the livestock that the Dutch brought with them, were unfamiliar to the Lenapes, and therefore they were very much concerned about this situation, this colony. My own interpretation, and I spent a lot of time working on this, is that the Swanendaels had seen what happened in the Chesapeake, where the Virginians had come in, taken as much land as they could, and killed many of the natives in the area, and stole their corn, burned their villages, and took over, basically. And they didn't want that to happen in the Delaware Valley. And so when they saw what they considered a plantation colony, and that's what it was, that's what the Dutch planned to do, they just said, we're going to stop this altogether, and killed everyone.
Well, can we just do an overview of who the Lenape were and where they lived and what some of their customs were, how they were structured?
Sure. The historians have approached who the Lenape were from different perspectives. Some have said that they were the people who lived from northern Delaware into eastern Pennsylvania, all the way up into southern New York. Others, and I'm including myself here, see two people in that expanse of land, and that the Lenapes were the people who lived from central New Jersey, from Trenton approximately south to northern Delaware, and then in eastern Pennsylvania up into the Lehigh Valley. Whereas the Munsees were a somewhat different group, but very much allied with the Lenapes, who lived in the area from central New Jersey up into southern New York.
Well, were they part of the Iroquois nation?
No. They were part of the Algonquian group of Algonquian-speaking people whose language was quite similar but ranged in a number of dialects. Like the Munsees and the Lenapes could understand one another very well, but they did have somewhat different customs and had different perspectives. The Lenapes, and here this goes back to my thesis in saying that the ideas of peace and freedom started with the Lenapes, were very much concerned about freedom, personal freedom, in that both women and men had the freedom to choose marriage partners. They could also divorce. And they were very loving parents and gave their children quite a bit of freedom.
You say, unlike their European counterparts, Native women held an equivalent status with men in their families and society, a fact that certainly accounted for the male European censure.
Yes, yes.
And Europeans didn't like that.
No, they thought that Lenape society was much too free and open, democratic, you might say. And here we have to be careful because we have to remember that it was the higher status Europeans who wrote this, because many Europeans were not able to write. And so like the Native Americans, we have to try to understand what they were thinking, without their writings indicating their attitudes.
How did the Lenape get along with other tribes in the area? I mean, were other tribes the peaceful, cooperative types, or did they have wars with their neighbors?
Yeah, they got along very well with the Munsees and with the Nanticokes and other northern Delaware and Maryland Eastern Shore groups. They had a war with the Susquehannocks. That was really inspired by the Dutch trade, because the Susquehannocks were looking for an outlet for that trade that they had established into Canada. And they tried in the northern Chesapeake, and that worked out for a while, but then ended. And so they wanted to push the Lenapes out of the Delaware Valley. And they attacked in the late 1620s. And they did push the Lenapes who were living on the west bank of the Delaware across into what is now New Jersey. That war lasted 8 or 10 years. We have just spotty records of what was happening there. But the Lenapes were not defeated. They retained their sovereignty over that area, but they made allies of the Susquehannocks. What the two groups agreed to was that the Susquehannocks would be able to trade in the Delaware Valley, but not that they had taken over control of the land. And that's a disputed point in the historiographies. Some historians have said that the Susquehannocks did take over the land, and that actually New Sweden was a client nation of the Susquehannocks. But that's not true, because if you read the deeds carefully, it's the Lenapes who are making the deals with the Europeans, not the Susquehannocks. The Susquehannocks were in attendance at some of these conferences, but they weren't the ones who were actually selling the land. Now, the Lenapes were also involved in a war between the Susquehannocks and the western nations of the Iroquois in the early 1660s. They fought with the Susquehannocks in that war. And the Susquehannocks, after that point, were very much diminished in population. Otherwise, the Lenapes were at peace with the Native Americans and also with the Europeans.
Was the Lenape relations with the Dutch, once the Dutch came in and took over, any different than it had been with the Swedes or the English later on? I mean, did they get along with the different groups at different rates?
They did. Well, with the Swedes, relations were not terribly good in the mid-1640s. Johan Prince was the governor. He was a military man.
There's a Governor Prince Park in
yes,
Tenneco.
That's right,
now.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very big man. The Native Americans called him Big Belly. And he saw them, as a military man, and actually was taking more land. I'm pretty sure this is what caused the problem, than the Lenapes expected to have taken from them. And so the Lenapes killed about 5 Swedes and Finns in New Sweden in the mid-1640s. But by the early 1650s, and then after the new governor, Johan Riesing, came in 1654, they started to make a really positive alliance with the Swedes and the Finns. And then I mentioned earlier, the Mercurius affair. And in that case, several things were going on, but I guess the most important for your question is that the Lenapes were looking for allies. They were allied with the Munsees, allied with the Susquehannocks, but they also welcomed the small numbers of Europeans as allies as well. The Swedes and the Finns and the Dutch all kept small towns, if you will, or hamlets. And they looked very much like the Lenape towns, in terms of size, in terms of agriculture. And so with friendship, the two groups could ally together. The Lenapes viewed them as part of their society, not merging as people, but keeping, being close to one another, adjacent neighborhoods. And they also freely entered each other's towns. At what point, when Riesing is governor, a visitor comes from Maryland and says, you shouldn't be allowing Lenapes to come into your town this way. It's simply, it's dangerous. And he said, well, that may be true, but it's too late now because they've been, visiting us, and we've been visiting them, for a long time, and we can't stop it now.
There was a mutiny by the Swedes against Governor Prince?
There was. They considered his governance heavy-handed, and they drew up a petition to send back to Sweden that included instances where he had taken the land of a Finnish couple because he wanted, according to this petition, he wanted the land for another manor. He already had the manor on Tinicum Island. He wanted another one in what is now Delaware County. And they cited many different complaints that they had against him. He took it very seriously. He killed a member of the military. They had a small group of troops. One of them signed on to this petition, and he had him executed. He arrested the minister and another freeman, and then he promised the others that they would be punished as well. But that petition helped to push him out because he needed the support of these people. He couldn't have most of the freemen in New Sweden against him. So he left with most of his family.
He had a daughter who stayed behind. She sounds like an interesting character.
She is. Armagard Prince. And she marries Johan Papagoja, who came to New Sweden as a lieutenant. He stays, but quickly he writes back to a government official in Sweden, says, I can't stay here without a wife, and because I can't do everything that women do here, cooking and cleaning, and and I'll have to leave if I can't attract Armagard to be my wife. And she was still young; she was only 19 or so, and she said no, I'm not interested at first, and her father also wasn't entirely interested, and he supported her. But finally they get married, but she was only about 20 at the time. And we lose sight of her for a few years. And then with the conquest of New Sweden by the Dutch, her husband, Papagoja, leaves. And and her father had left as well. And so she stayed to manage the two estates of Johan Prince. And I argue in the book that she became a central figure in New Sweden. And I say I argue it from the actions that take place. While Riesing was governor, and her father obviously had left, and her husband had also left, she challenges his authority, the governor's authority. She tries to attract, in fact, she does attract several officers in the Swedish company, and she attracts the chief negotiator, interpreter with the Susquehannocks and the Lenapes to come and work with her to manage the estates, and also to be more active in the fur trade. And so Riesing puts up a fight and tells these men that they better stay with the company, or he was going to report back and they would be in trouble. And so they stay with him. But she had really challenged his authority there. And I don't know what might have happened if she had been able to, hold her own there. I don't think she would have tried to be governor, but later on you can see where she's still being a central part of that society.
You talk in your book how the original settlers were predominantly men by 80 or 90%. Was there much intermarriage with the Indians?
Again, I know from later information that is not at the point of New Sweden that there had been intermarriage, because many of the Lenape leaders by the mid-18th century were people who's descended from both Europeans and Lenapes. They were, and also, throughout early America, with such skewed sex ratios, we know that European men intermarried or established relationships with Native women. And so that's definitely an important part of how these two peoples, that is, bunching together the Europeans and the Lenapes, established a good relationship.
When do the English show up?
The English take over New Netherland in 1664, and the military who had been assigned to take over Manhattan, and actually all of the land owned by the Duke of York to the eastern side of the Delaware River, decide that, well, even though we haven't been told to take over the western bank as well, they extend their conquest to what is now Delaware and eastern Pennsylvania. So they take over in 1664. And you had asked earlier about the relationship of the Lenapes with the English. That was really poor for at least 10 years. The Lenapes were much concerned that the English now had colonies from Massachusetts, from New England to the Carolinas. And they knew that they would have more trouble negotiating with the English, looking at the experience that other Native Americans had had with the English. And so, but they were willing to try. The bad relations didn't occur immediately. But by the late 1660s, the Lenapes realized that what the English wanted to do was take their land, and that with that, they would lose their sovereignty, and they thought they'd lose their freedom as well. They were much concerned that the English were involved in slavery, and so the last thing they wanted was to be enslaved. So they engaged in what we could call mourning war. That is a war in which the Lenapes atoned or looked for a way to get compensation for the death of their families. They didn't conduct mourning war in the same way as the Iroquois.
This is mourning with a U,
Yes,
M-O-U,
yes,
and,
yeah, right. They were in mourning for their lost loved ones.
Did the English kill many of the Lenape?
No. And that is because of the way in which the Lenapes and the Swedes and the Finns and some Dutch allied together, because the English did not send many troops to the Delaware Valley. The memory of Swanendael was still there, and so they did not immediately try to establish large plantations there. They had a lot to do in Manhattan and the New York area, so they were focusing there initially. But by the late 60s, Governor Francis Lovelace decided that he wanted to establish more hierarchy over the Delaware Valley.
And the Swedes and Dutch and Finns stuck around after the English took over?
Yes.
They didn't go back home?
Yeah, right. They did. They had established relationships there, farms, improvements, and I mean, some did. Some certainly went to Maryland. At this point, they weren't returning to Sweden for the most part. Armagard Prince does, but most of the Swedes and the Finns stayed there. It was a good country, and they had good relations with the natives. And so together, they really fought off the efforts of the English to take over. And this happened in a couple of different ways. The Lenapes killed at least 10 English and their Dutch allies during the 10 years after 1664. This is when Lovelace is governor. And Lovelace refuses to follow patterns that the Dutch and the Swedish governors had done before. And that is, he would not recognize that the natives could cover the deaths of people with wampum or other trade goods. It was, part of the Lenape culture, and Native American culture more generally, that rather than calling for the head or the body of someone who had murdered another, they would accept compensation. Okay, so that's called covering the dead. And he also didn't recognize the importance of having treaties, of renewing compensation for land on a yearly basis. And what he did was not meet with the Lenapes at all, had no treaties with them. And each time an English person was murdered by a Lenape, he required that the person be brought in, dead or alive. And the Lenapes just said, forget it, we're not doing it. You come talk to us, you're settling in a way that is challenging our ownership of the land. And that's who the Lenapes were killing. It would be settlers in areas that had not been sold or had not been in any way compensated for. And that included land near the falls of the Delaware, Trenton area, Burlington area, in that area, and also in central Delaware. And so the Lenapes were really keeping the English under rein in saying, okay, if you go there, someone's going to kill you. This to Lovelace was war. And so he called upon the Swedes and the Finns and the Dutch and the English in the Delaware Valley to declare war on the Lenapes. And he kept sending messages.
Where was he at the time?
He was in Manhattan, New York. Mm-hmm. And he may have gone somewhere else. I think he did go to other parts of the New York, but he didn't visit the Delaware Valley. And so he kept sending messages and saying, you're not doing your duty. The New York governor is getting people together to fight the Lenapes, which they didn't do in any case. You should be ashamed of not, being courageous enough. And the Swedes and Finns would say to the English commander in Newcastle, would say, oh, it's too early to get together because we had to bring in our animals and our hay. And then a month later they said, well, we still haven't gotten it in. And if we go now in the winter, the ice is going to be on the river and we won't be able to do anything anyway. So they, just put them off over this time. But basically they had no intention whatsoever of going to war against the Lenapes.
How much time between when the English showed up and when William Penn showed up?
1664 to 81. So that's what, 15 years?
Did things change when Penn arrived?
Well, actually, things changed when Edmund Andrews became somewhat governor for the Duke of York in 1674. And he went back to recognizing the principle of covering the dead. He met with the Lenapes a number of times. At the first meeting with them, he came in saying, I want to be your friend, let's resolve our problems.
Was he appointed by Penn?
No, he's appointed by the Duke of York. So it's still under the Duke of York. And he really changes the tone of relationships. But he had to, because the natives of New England were fighting the colonists there in King Philip's War. In Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia and also parts of Maryland, the Susquehannocks were at war against the colonists there.
Couldn't handle one more war.
No, he was very much concerned. And the Lenapes threatened to join against the war against the English as well. So he didn't have much choice, but he was also much cannier than Lovelace had been. And he understood. He still wanted their land, though.
You have a picture of, in your book, of the painting, William Penn's treaty with the Indians. And you say the painting helped to perpetuate the myths that William Penn originated good relations with the Lenapes and that they passively received his beneficence.
Yes.
Did they not passively receive his beneficence?
No, they didn't. They were definitely willing to sell land, as they had sold to previous settlements. They were very happy to receive the trade goods, but they too still expected annual gifts for the land, and they expected to have treaties. They definitely did not expect as many people would come as did. I can't imagine that they understood that 8,000 English and other Europeans would arrive in 5 years after 1682. And so that became very much a concern to them. And while they were happy with the Quakers who came in peace and wanted to buy the land, Penn spent a lot of money on the trade goods that he first bought the land with. But by 1685-86, the Lenapes realized that this was becoming English country. It wasn't really Lenape country, at least on the west bank of the Delaware. And Penn ran out of money. One of the reasons he left Pennsylvania in 1684, and he only stayed for 2 years, was that he had to go back to England and get his finances in order.
Did Penn ever butt heads with the Indians?
Not violently. He didn't have a militia. He definitely didn't want to have any kind of military action against them. And
you say in here you have a transaction where William Penn was trying to arrange a trade, and Lenape thought they weren't being treated fairly, and you say Penn responded that he had given the Lenapes match coats, stockings, and guns as a down payment, and if therefore they are rude and unruly, you must make them keep their word by just course. If the Indians, and this other guy, Tammany, the Indians will not punish him, we will and must, for they must never see you are afraid of executing the justice they ought to do.
Yes. Well, Penn was giving instructions that I think it was Thomas Home he was writing to, and Home didn't follow through. I mean, he tried to keep good relations, just as Governor Markham did too, tried to keep good relations because the Lenapes had the potential to do violence against the settlers. And they used the threats in order to keep power, even though they were in the minority by 1686. their population had decreased because of another smallpox epidemic in the late 1670s. So they were at a disadvantage in terms of their population that they had not had earlier, before Penn came. And so they used the threats to convince the Quakers, that they couldn't do. If the Quakers had been willing to use military action, the colony could have gone in the same direction as others, war and constant violence, whereas the Tammany and other sachems from that area might kill some livestock or threaten to burn homes. I don't think they actually burned homes at that point.
What ultimately became of the Lenape?
Well, they're here.
They are still here? There's
Yes.
still Lenape living?
Yes. Well, yes, in the Delaware Valley. There are two groups recognized by the New Jersey state government, one in Bridgeton and one in Burlington County. And in eastern Pennsylvania, there are about 12 different groups of Lenapes. But many, and probably most Lenapes in the 18th century did move west and live in Oklahoma and Canada and other places in the United States.
Are you working on another book?
I am. I'm working on a book on New Jersey, on West New Jersey. I do spend a fair amount of time in this book talking about relations between Native Americans and the colonists in West New Jersey, though I think I focus more on Pennsylvania in this book. But I really want to write a social history of West New Jersey that includes the Lenapes.
And your full-time job as a teacher?
It is. I'm a professor of history at Lehigh University.
And what do you teach?
Colonial American history, and I've taught historical methods as well.
Well, we've been speaking with Jean Soderlund. She is the author of this book, Lenape Country, Delaware Valley Society Before William Penn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.